So we're at the point of the year where we are at the home stretch. We are counting down the days to the best books published in 2023. And I gotta say, when it comes to horror fiction and other dark things, I thought I had my list pretty much down pat. It's been a fantastic year. I have found so many new favorites, and I pretty much have my top 10 in place. However, I'm gonna have to make some room on that list because I've just read another batch of amazing 2023 releases. Hopefully you're on board for that. Let's get started. First, I think you're gonna see this book on a lot of people's favorites list, but I just read Deliver Me by Elle Nash, and this is a story that follows a young woman who is trying to get pregnant. She works at a meat packing plant, so you can imagine all of the gross things that ensues. And then on top of that, she has tried multiple times to get pregnant, and those attempts have ended in miscarriage. So obvious content warnings for anyone who finds that content sensitive. But in terms of a story, this one packs a powerful punch. We follow this young woman who comes from this evangelical background. They live with their boyfriend, who they call daddy, not their actual daddy, but it's still a very strange, awkward, uncomfortable relationship. However, they are pregnant again and believe that this time is going to be different. We follow them at the beginning of the story as they are working in this meat packing plant. They have a very grueling job, and we follow them along through that. They are trying to make sense of this pregnancy and move through their life. And oh man, I love this book. It's weird, it's uncomfortable, it's super gross, and I was really immersed in it. So definitely, given the meat packing aspect of the story, this one did give me vibes of Tender is the Flesh. And while it's certainly not the same story, I do think it'll have similar feels for anyone looking for something similar. This is probably the closest rep I've had since reading Meat by Joseph Delancey. And so this is one I had a great time with. I thought the writing was very beautiful. It's got a nice style to the prose, which is a strange thing to say about a book that is so awkward to read about. Definitely this book leans into some heavy criticisms and analysis of the evangelical church, and so go into this book expecting that if that's something you're looking for. If it's not, this might not be the book for you. But certainly it has a lot of commentary on the lifestyle and communities that often surround certain church groups and how they can have certain beliefs and the different ideas and all behind that. You know what I'm talking about. So if you can't tell, I had a great time reading this book. It was dark, it was unflinching. It wasn't quite a 5-star read for me, and I should let you know if you don't check out my Goodreads, because I do always have a star rating there. So I loved it, but it was 4 stars, mostly because I don't know if it quite accomplished what it was trying to do, or in my mind, while it was dark and unflinching and uncomfortable and hit on a lot of topics I love, I personally typically need a book to really just hit that spot in order to get a solid 5 stars, because this book did kind of have a messy narrative. I didn't entirely know what it was trying to say at certain times, but did I love the pieces of it? Did I have a great time reading this book? Was I engrossed in it? Could not put it down, and was constantly reading it every chance I got? Absolutely. If you share my love for really messed up, dark social commentary that is biting and uncomfortable, this is the next one you want to read. Next is The Last to Leave the Room by Starling, and this is a story that follows a woman who is designated or responsible for being part of this team that needs to investigate what is happening within the city that appears to be sinking. They are inside of this building, and they are just fascinated by it because it appears like the building itself is moving. There's something going on. They go down and it just appears to be drowning or something else happening. This is a book that obviously blends together ideas of suspense and horror, something kind of leaning into the idea of something like House of Leaves, but it definitely takes a surrealist take. It's very unusual, unsettling, strange, and that is what I love so much about Starling. If you don't know, she's the same author who wrote The Luminous Dead, a sci-fi horror suspense that I've done a separate review on, and I totally understand it is hit or miss with people for a reason. What I think the author does so well in that book, as well as in this one, is creating a sense of unease. Creating a sense where this just feels very weird and odd and strange. And if you like that ambiguous feeling when you're reading a book and you're not quite sure what you're reading, that's the experience I got reading this. I really struggle, even after finishing it, to really put it into a genre box or have a label or compare it to much else besides The Luminous Dead, because it's kind of a what did I just read type of story. So that might definitely attract some of you. I will admit that I like The Luminous Dead a little bit more. This one, while it was weird and strange, didn't quite capture the same atmosphere that I found with her other debut novel. I think for me where this book was lacking is the fact that it just was not as eerie, and it did fall into the same trap that I think a lot of us, including myself, understand about The Luminous Dead. While it has a great buildup of suspense, I found The Luminous Dead, while I love it, I do recommend it, it doesn't have the biggest climax and payoff. And once again with this one, I wasn't entirely sure what the author was trying to do with the ending they gave us, and it left me kind of wanting more. So it's a book I enjoyed in pieces, but I don't think it came together as a full cohesive story. I can only partially recommend it. There's things I like about it, but there's a lot I didn't. And personally, I'd recommend The Luminous Dead first. I would kind of recommend this one primarily to the people who love The Luminous Dead and are looking for something like that by this author. I think it kind of does the same thing, but not quite. Next we have Good Girls Don't Die by Christina Henry. And this is a story that follows a woman who finds herself in this life that is not hers, and she just doesn't understand how she got there. The story starts out with her appearing to be the mother of this daughter who is rushing off to school, and she has to make a lunch, and she just immediately has to kind of fake her way through this life, pretending to be this mother, pretending to be this spouse, and figure it all out as she goes along. But she's really lost as to who she is or where she is or why this is all happening. In terms of a setup, I thought that the premise and start to the story were great. I went into this book super blind and just found myself wondering what was going on. It's the kind of story that I feel would make a good television show just because it kind of has that air of mystery and that intrigue. And I've always said about Christina Henry that she's a really good storyteller. And that still holds up with this book. If you follow my channel, you know that I've read and reviewed most of her work at this point, and I do really enjoy her. While this author is not always a 5-star author for me, they consistently write books that are close to 4-star just because they write something that's very compelling, easy to fly through, and generally very digestible. This one of their work, in my opinion, is one of the weaker ones. I like the setup a little bit more than the finish and finale. I found the middle section a little bit murky in terms of the narrative. I didn't exactly know what the author was trying to accomplish, and I think that they could have streamlined the story, or I don't know, kind of ramped it up a little bit more. It was a bit more contemporary fiction at times than I would have liked. It certainly starts there. And for an author who is known for writing some really great horror and suspense, I feel this one is kind of more of a lighter thriller, a little bit more women's fiction-y than I would like it to be. Certainly it has those aspects to it, but I don't think that this one has the wide appeal as some of her other books. It works, but there are ones that I'd recommend before this one, personally, at least given my taste. Next is another favorite of mine, and that is Becoming the Boogeyman by Richard Chizmar. This is a follow-up to a book that I loved and gushed about the year it came out, which I think was 2 years ago, and that one was Chasing the Boogeyman. So in the first book, we follow Richard Chizmar, who describes himself as being a character within his own story. So it's fictionalized, but it reads like a memoir because the author draws from his real life. He uses his real name, I believe it's his real wife, and it kind of ties in a lot of things that make this book very meta and self-aware, and just blurs the line between reality and fiction, which, if you follow my channel, is one of my favorite things in books. So in the first book, there's a setup of this potential serial killer. Women are going missing, or young girls, and he remembers as a child going through his childhood, wondering what was going on, the unease of living in a neighborhood and community where people possibly aren't safe. And so we follow him as he's a child, and then is also reflecting back as an adult as he attempts to write a book about his childhood experience. Eventually, within the first book, I'm not going to spoil it, but you do get some reveals as to what was actually happening. You do get a satisfying ending to it. And then this next book, without saying too much, follows afterwards. Essentially, there's a potential copycat on the loose of an individual who's doing similar crimes to what happened when Richard Chizmar was a child in this story. And so it's happening again because he wrote a book within this story called Chasing the Boogeyman. He is now called back to try to help the police to solve what is going on. They don't believe it's the original killer for reasons, but instead are trying to figure out, is someone copycatting? Is there something else? And so forth. And he gets sucked right back into the story. I love the first book, and I love the second book just as much. And that is a hard thing for me to say, because often when it comes to sequels, especially when it comes to thrillers and horrors and all of that, is I find that they can be very repetitive, and the idea that it's super fresh in the first book often just feels a bit tired when it's done again in a follow-up. But this book really feels like the second half of the story. This is one of those times that if it was a movie, you would watch part 1, and then this second book feels like watching part 2. It feels like a cohesive story. Even though part 1 worked entirely by itself, this adds on to it in a way that doesn't feel like a cheap money grab or anything like that by the author. It was so compelling. I love the nostalgia of the story. This book is a clear love letter to Stephen King fans. I've said it before and I'll say it again, that if you love Stephen King, you really should read this series, or duology now, because there are so many nods to his books and his short stories and all those little aspects. Clearly the author has a relationship or friendship with Stephen King, and he just ties into the story in a way that is so satisfying and just had me geeking out at certain points. And I'm not even a crazy Stephen King fan, but it's done so well with these great Easter eggs that I had so much fun reading this. I'll be honest, this is definitely one of the best books I've read so far this year. I was completely obsessed with it, had a really good time, and I really hope those of you will check it out as well. If you are going to read the story, I would personally recommend going back to the beginning with Chasing the Boogeyman. You could start with Becoming the Boogeyman. The beginning of the story catches you up to speed and gives you all the information so you know where that story ended. But the first book is also so good that I don't want to deprive you of that experience. So please go read the first book. If you haven't yet, go read the second. It was so good, so well done, and I hope that you enjoyed as well. Next is Delicate Condition by Danielle Valentine. This is the same author who writes as Daniel Vega when they're doing young adult. In this story, it is a horror thriller that follows a woman who, along with her husband, are attempting to do an IVF cycle as the story starts. They are going through the process of the extraction and then the implantation, and then we follow them as they are attempting to bring this pregnancy all the way to its conclusion. I don't want to give away more of the synopsis. I think the book might actually say a little bit more, but I think it's best to go into the story as blind as possible, and so I'm going to talk more about my experience with it rather than just talking plot point. If you don't know, this is public knowledge that I conceived my son through IVF, so a story like this, a piece of fiction that delves into IVF, definitely hit home for me. So for me, I was talking about this with my friends online, that there were definitely a lot of moments within the story, little details about the drugs and the experience and the nurses, and all of these micro details that are so close to home for me really brought me back several years and kind of brought me back into the mindset of that time period. It was very emotional, it was very expensive, and it's definitely an experience I will never forget. And so I loved a book that really captured those details so well. I haven't at this time Googled it, but I strongly suspect the author themselves have gone through IVF because the details in this book were just so good. So if they did not, I apologize, but clearly they have done their homework. They must have friends or family and other people in their lives that have gone through this, because the details were far more specific than what you're going to read on Wikipedia if you're doing your own research. In terms of the story itself, I know a lot of you watching this aren't necessarily those that have gone through IVF and perhaps have no interest in a book that is going to talk about the process, and so I want to assure you this is a book that I would widely recommend. Certainly I think it's going to have the most appeal to women and mothers and so forth, but I do know I have friends of all genders and backgrounds that have really enjoyed this one because at its core, it's a really biting, smart story. This one, clearly given its setup, a pregnancy story, it's going to have nods to some of the classics like Rosemary's Baby, but it is not a retelling. It goes to some different places. It makes nods and references to that work, but it goes in different direction. It subverts the tropes, and it really left me at many times with some unexpected twists and turns. What I love so much about the story, going back to the IVF angle, is that within the story, it surprisingly has an optimistic and very kind messaging within it. If you don't know, a lot of horror of, I believe, the 70s and 80s sprung from the fear of what it would mean to have test tube babies. Would they be born without a soul? I have heard it all, even in the time period that I conceived my child. So to read a book that addresses that and brings in some unexpected and subversive ways of talking about it in a way that I really love just hit me in the heart. But at the same time, this book is cutting and brilliant. I do think it leans more on the side of thriller. You're going to have a lot of times where you're suspecting different people, and my paranoia was all over the place. I went back and forth about who to believe, and again, I think the author did a good job of creating some red herrings, and I definitely went down some rabbit holes that were not correct, and just overall a really enjoyable read. So for me, this was a really solid personal read, but I do think again that even if you don't have necessarily an interest in IVF as a topic, if you love a really good domestic thriller that is juicy and biting and plays around with the horror tropes while still leaning into a thriller narrative similar to something like Riley Sager does, this is one that I do highly recommend. I read Just Like Mother last year, that Tor Nightfire title, and honestly I was kind of disappointed by how it handled these topics. And so in my mind, and this is the book that I wanted it to be. This book is so strong, so smart, and if you can't tell, I loved it. Next, let's talk about Death of a Bookseller by Slater. And this is a thriller that is written as a love letter to true crime fans. I haven't been reading as much true crime this year, but reading a book like this really reminds me that I want to get back to that obsession. This is a story that follows a woman who is obsessed with true crime herself. She loves the podcast and all of that, and she spends her days working in a bookshop. However, her life in the bookshop isn't as exciting. She doesn't really get a lot of passion from it. However, that changes when another colleague comes along. This new coworker is also obsessed with true crime, and she of course tries to build this friendship. The other girl appears to be a bit more standoffish, so you find that there's more going on. Eventually it's revealed that they have a history themselves, and so the true crime obsession that started as something that was very separate from their life gets pulled in when they actually have a personal connection to a crime situation, and together they address and deal with it. This is a book I love. The references and nods to true crime favorite books. It references the classics of the genre, things like Helter Skelter, but it also goes into more popular and new ones like referencing to I'll Be Gone in the Dark. There's some great conversations and chatter about Ted Bundy and the movies around it. And while I have not read every true crime book out there, I still am catching up, especially on more of the older ones. But for me, the references and all of that were just so well done, so on point, and the references I did understand were just brilliant, hilarious, smart, and cutting. This certainly is not the scariest book I've read. It's a little bit of a lighter tone despite the fact that it deals with true crime, and I really think that this book is a great commentary or discussion surrounding true crime, which I'll admit is something that I grapple with myself. I am very fascinated with this subgenre. However, I'm very aware that I'm reading stories about people who have been victimized, and I never want to celebrate villains or kind of lift them up on a pedestal. So this book really delves into the fact that people, especially women, are really obsessed with true crime, why that is, and discusses it in a very nuanced, interesting way. The criticisms and the counter criticisms, and I think that it's just, again, a book that if you love true crime or know someone who loves true crime, this is a book that I would definitely check out. I think it is just so smart, so witty, and I had a great time reading it. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And please let me know down below in the comments, what is a 2023 horror, thriller, or dark fiction release that you want me to get to before the end of the year? As I mentioned, my top 10 list is bursting. It might need to become a top 15. Let me know if you're interested in me filming a longer video. But yeah, it has been a great year for dark fiction, and I want to read all the books right now. So while I'm in the mood, give me your recommendations. If you're new to my channel and want to stick around, subscribe. I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, and fantasy. And if you want to help me out with this video, you can give me a thumbs up. You can drop a comment, even if it's just a spooky ghost or a vampire. Get creative, and I'll talk to you down below. Otherwise, talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.